January 30th, 1968. Deep in the night. Saigon. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, received an urgent report. General, simultaneous attacks have begun across South Vietnam. He stared at the map. Red X marks kept appearing without end. In that moment, what was going through his mind? 2:45 in the morning. The heart of Saigon. A Viet Cong sapper unit had breached the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. In the courtyard of the embassy, the very symbol of American power, a firefight erupted. Marine Guards fought back. 6 hours of gunfire. 6 hours that would shake the world. Here is the critical fact. The attackers never entered the embassy's main building. In the end, every last one was killed or captured. But early reports told a different story. The embassy itself had been seized. That false report amplified the shock beyond measure. Footage of the embassy attack, part of the broader Tet Offensive, was broadcast as breaking news and special coverage, played and replayed across America's airwaves, sending shockwaves through the nation. Every night, the American people watched the war in Vietnam unfold on their televisions. But the images of that morning were different. Inside the embassy grounds, sappers locked in combat, at the very place that stood as a symbol of American authority. For years, the Johnson administration had insisted, "We are winning this war. The enemy is weakening." But what these images spoke was a completely different reality. This attack was no accident. North Vietnam's leadership had spent over a year planning every detail. But here, we must hold on to a critical truth. In the late 1960s, real power in North Vietnam lay with hardliners led by First Secretary Le Duan. President Ho Chi Minh's health had deteriorated. He had already lost his grip on power. Records suggest that General Von Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh himself had concerns that this operation was premature. The man who drove the Tet Offensive was Le Duan. His ambitions were layered and complex. Military devastation, the destabilization of the South Vietnamese government, a shift in the conditions for negotiation, and a seismic shift in American public opinion. Recent historical research has revealed an even more calculated dimension. Le Duan, it is argued, also saw this campaign as a way to bleed out the southern Viet Cong, who had grown difficult to control, and tighten Hanoi's grip. If that is true, the Tet Offensive was a strategy that killed two birds with one stone. 2 months before the Tet Offensive began, General Westmoreland stood before Congress in Washington. "We have the upper hand. The enemy is crumbling. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel." President Johnson repeated the same refrain. "We are moving forward." Most Americans were skeptical, but uncertain. Still, they wanted to believe. Then came January 30th, 1968, and that light went dark. What happened that night across all of South Vietnam? Major cities, provincial capitals, military installations. More than 100 targets struck simultaneously. In Saigon alone, the embassy, the presidential palace, Air Force headquarters, and the national radio station were hit at the same moment. The words "the enemy is crumbling" collapsed under their own weight. Hue, Vietnam's ancient capital, a city steeped in history, home to the imperial citadel. Viet Cong forces seized the city and raised the liberation flag on the flagpole of the imperial palace. The battle for this city would become the most ferocious of the entire Tet Offensive. For nearly a month, savage urban warfare raged before U.S. and South Vietnamese forces could reclaim it. Different sources draw different lines around the occupation and recapture, but no one disputes that the Battle of Hue was a crucible of unimaginable violence. February 1st, 1968. A street in Saigon. Nguyen Ngoc Loan, chief of the National Police of South Vietnam, stood face to face with a Viet Cong prisoner. In the next instant, he pulled the trigger. A P photographer, Eddie Adams, captured that moment. The photograph spread across the world. AP's Eddie Adams was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for spot news photography. What America saw, it was not a just war, an execution on a public street, a death sentence without trial, carried out by an Allies police chief. That single photograph shattered support for the war. Television changed everything. In the late 1960s, The vast majority of American households owned a TV set. Every night, the three major networks delivered footage of the battlefield into living rooms across the country. This was different from every war that came before. The battlefield had been brought into the living room. Marines fighting in the streets of Hue. Vietnamese children crying out in terror. Soldiers fallen inside the embassy grounds. The American people could not look away. February 27th. Walter Cronkite had returned from Vietnam. He had gone to see it for himself. He had looked with his own eyes. Then he sat down before the camera. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. These were not the words of an ordinary commentator. Cronkite was the most widely trusted news anchor in America. There's a famous story that, upon hearing Cronkite's broadcast, President Johnson said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." However, the primary source for this quote has never been confirmed. It should be treated as an anecdote with disputed origins. Still, the shockwave Cronkite's broadcast sent through public opinion was beyond doubt. The Tet Offensive was a military failure. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were ultimately driven from every city they had seized. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces counterattacked and reclaimed the lost ground. The losses suffered by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong were staggering. The Southern Viet Cong, the liberation forces, were dealt a devastating, near-fatal blow. On the battlefield, it was a total defeat. But at that very moment, something had broken, irreparably, inside America. Recent historical research points to this. The Tet Offensive alone did not reverse public opinion. The distrust was already there, the credibility gap. The mounting grief over an ever-growing casualty count. Resistance to the draft and the economic burden of war. Tet was the trigger that made it all visible and turned a slow decline into a collapse. Two voices were locked in battle inside Lyndon Johnson's mind. One voice said, "Send more troops. We might still win. To withdraw is to admit defeat." The other voice answered, "There are already 550,000 men in Vietnam. How many more will it take?" As Gallup polls and other surveys show, support for the Vietnam War had already fallen sharply between 1965 and 1968. Tet sent that decline into free fall. Records tell us that during this period, Johnson was calling aides in the middle of the night. He could not sleep. March 12th. The New Hampshire Democratic primary. Senator Eugene McCarthy, an unknown challenger running on an anti-war platform, captured 42% of the vote. The sitting president, Johnson, won only 49%. In the world of politics, it was an unthinkable margin. Johnson understood. If he sought re-election, he would have to fight through the Democratic primaries. And that fight would become a war over Vietnam itself. His hands trembled. The night of March 31st, President Johnson sat before the cameras. All of America was watching. He announced a halt to bombing in North Vietnam. He signaled his willingness to pursue peace talks. And then, at the end of his address, he said, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The studio fell silent. The sitting president had stepped aside. 2 months after the Tet Offensive. On the battlefield, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong had suffered catastrophic defeat. But in the arena of politics, Hanoi had won. 1968 would become the most turbulent year in modern American history. April 4th. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. June 6th. Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. He had been a candidate for the presidency. The anti-war movement swept across campuses nationwide. In Chicago, outside the Democratic National Convention, police and young protesters clashed in the streets. America was being torn apart from within. Not just on the battlefields of Vietnam. The numbers tell the story. According to annual U.S. military casualty statistics, 1968 was the deadliest year of the entire Vietnam War for American forces. And support for the war plummeted. As Gallup and other surveys document, support for the Vietnam War fell sharply between 1965 and 1968. The same war, but no longer the same nation. January 1969. Richard Nixon was inaugurated as president. He promised peace with honor, the policy of Vietnamization, gradually drawing down U.S. ground forces while building up the capacity of South Vietnam's army. That was the cornerstone policy, and it began. But the war did not end quickly. 1969, 1970, 1971, 1972. The war went on. American forces continued to withdraw. But the situation in South Vietnam did not improve. The wound carved by the Tet Offensive ran deep. January 1973. The Paris Peace Accords were signed. American forces withdrew from Vietnam. The war was over. But South Vietnam still existed. The fighting with North Vietnam continued. South Vietnam, stripped of its American pillar. It was a ticking time bomb. April 30th, 1975. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. From the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy, the last helicopter lifted off. The American flag was lowered. Saigon fell. The Vietnam War was over. Victory for North Vietnam. 7 years after the Tet Offensive. From that night forward, everything had changed. And one final irony remains. The Southern Viet Cong, devastated by the Tet Offensive, were not the protagonists of the war that followed. The force that fought to the end and claimed victory was the North Vietnamese Regular Army. In the end, post-war Vietnam was unified under the leadership of Hanoi. So, what can we take from this story? The Tet Offensive fundamentally changed the history of warfare. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were crushed militarily, but they succeeded in triggering a strategic turning point. The reason was simple. The battlefield was not only the jungle. The television screen was also a battlefield. Public opinion was also a battlefield. But to believe that Tet reversed public opinion in a single blow is too simple. The distrust had already accumulated resistance to the draft, doubt over the growing death toll. Tet was the trigger that made it all visible and sent it into acceleration. When the narrative of victory collapsed, actual victories on the battlefield ceased to matter. This lesson would be carried forward into every war that followed. And now, a question for you. History only speaks of outcomes, but those who lived through it knew none of it. If you had been an American in 1968 and you had just heard Cronkite's words, what would you have felt? What would you have decided? And at this very moment, somewhere in the world, an invisible battlefield is being fought. With weapons called information, imagery, and narrative. What standard do you use to decide what to believe? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for staying with me until the very end. What the Tet Offensive of 1968 proved. The outcome of a war is not decided on the battlefield alone. This channel digs into the wars, empires, and revolutions that changed human history, not from the surface, but from within the minds of those who lived those decisions. If you want to get closer to the psychology of the people who lived at the moment of decision, not the surface of history, subscribe and turn on notifications. Until next time.